So Lisa, could you tell us a little bit about growing up and how you learned your stories?
Yeah, I learned it, I guess, in like two different ways. One is that my father was a great storyteller, and he was very dramatic. He would tell stories, and it often, sometimes after my brother and I were in bed, we had bunk beds, and he was like 6'3", was very tall, and he would stuff pillows underneath and become like big, to seem to us big like a troll. And he would come into our bedroom after we had turned the lights off, go, I smell the smell of human flesh. Are there children here? And we would like, ah! Get scared, and then he would, tell us stories. And you were scared always in kind of a delightful way, because you knew that you were smarter than the trolls. You just always knew they were not very brainy. It was just brute force. They were bullies, they were evil, they were nasty. But for the most part, they didn't come, they couldn't, we were much too smart for them. But, when you were a bad kid, like from my mom, I learned a lot of the troll lore. Like, she was the one, if you were being really bad, she would just say, you are being a troll kid, and so the idea was that, you had gone towards the darker side, and that's when you became like a troll. And you better watch out, because trolls can jump into words, and they can wreak havoc. So there was that presence. So from my mom, I got a lot of the lore and the superstition, and from my dad, I got the actual stories. And if you grow up in Norway, it's such a dramatic landscape. It is very beautiful, but it is beautiful in almost sort of a haunting, almost at times frightening way, because in the winter it is so dark. If you live in northern Norway, it never gets lighter than dusk in the middle of the day. But then in the summertime, it is just bright light all the time. And so there's this sort of contrast. And then the mountains, it seems like Norway is mostly mountains and forest, and that's the homeland of the trolls. There used to be more trolls in Sweden and Denmark, but it was more populated, and trolls just hate noise, and so they kept moving northwards to Norway, and farther north, and then into the mountains. And so they didn't like humans. They were in stark opposition to us. And there would be, so you were aware of trolls, because if you were driving in the countryside and it was maybe a part of Norway where it's like where I grew up in Oslo and where we had our cabin, it's kind of fertile, and it's got fields, not huge fields like in the United States, but cute little fields surrounded by woods. But here and there would suddenly be one huge rock in the middle of an otherwise open field. And you just were always told that was tossed there by an angry troll who minded the noise that humans were making. And they particularly aimed them at churches and church bells, because they couldn't bear that sound. And like if you go hiking in the mountains, which is one of the most time-honored things for Norwegians to do, is you go skiing in the mountains, you go hiking in the mountains, but almost every mountain is a dead troll. There's a story attached to them, and you can kind of see them in the landscape. There's the troll tongue, there's the troll wall, there's the troll peak, there's just whole, mountain ranges that were named after, trolls. Some of them are nasty trolls chasing after pretty maidens, and didn't make it. There's just different. So each region has its own sets of stories that you might learn. So there's the stories that were written down by Asbjørnsen and Moe in the mid-1800s through 1880, 1900, but then there's the general folklore. So yeah, it was everywhere.
And in Norway, I remember at one point in an interview you talked about the importance of telling troll stories in Norway, or for Norwegian parents to tell those stories.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure how Norwegians feel about it today, but it is part of Norwegian heritage. If you're going to ask what is the most Norwegian thing that there is, they're going to tell you it's the cheese slicer, the cheese planer, and it's the certain pattern on the knitted mittens. It's the cross country skiing, maybe the paper clip. They're very proud of the paper clip, because it was used as a symbol in opposition to the Nazis during World War II, and it's a Norwegian invention. Small but extremely useful. But then they would also say the trolls, because trolls has been part of Norwegian folklore, part of Norwegian heritage since long, even before the Vikings. So in Norse mythology, the first thing that came into the existence out of the void was a huge giant named Ymir. He was just an enormous giant. And then from between his toes and under his armpit sprang the first race of trolls. So trolls was practically the second thing that came into existence in the world. And so they have been with Norwegians for a really long time.
And nowadays people talk about, scary stories that they might be harmful for children and that sort of thing. And when you think about the value of troll stories for kids and kids' education, what's the connection there, do you think?
Well, folk tales, of course, were initially never intended just for children. And so you have to gauge your audience, right? I mean, there are stories I would never in a million years tell to a kindergartner, because it would really, really scare them. But then there's stories like the Three Billy Goats Gruff. They're scary, but not so scary that they can't handle it. And what they really learn from those stories is, what you are not. You are not a troll. And when you hear those stories, you learn what it is to be not human, and also, but at the same time, what it is that you have. So, to defeat a troll, you have to use your brains. You have to be patient. You've got to be kind of clever. You have to be very persistent. Some of the stories, it's, usually always takes at least 3 tries before you manage to beat a troll. And you have to be quite clever to do it. Like I said, you got to use your brain, but you have to also cooperate with friends. You can usually not do it all on your own. Sometimes you can. In the stories that I just told, you can, but in a lot of the longer stories, the ones that I tell for, 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, usually the hero or heroine relies on, the help from some, maybe some unlikely helpers. Or what I really like about Scandinavian folktales is that, there's certainly the princess, but she's never a damsel in distress. Usually if there's a princess, she's somebody to be reckoned with. And the prince or the hero might supply, a lot of the action, but she supplies the brains and the method for, what needs to be done. So when the two cooperate, then the trolls have no chance. So there's a lot to learn about how to be a human being and how to be the best kind of human being. Gosh, I wish politicians read troll stories.
Now, a lot of times we think of trolls as being villains in stories. Are there any troll stories where they're not villains?
No.
No, they're always villains. Okay.
They're villains. I mean, there can be some confusion because a lot of Swedish and Danish stories use the word troll, but what they really mean is, they're different languages. So they have stories that have trolls that are similar to Norwegian stories, but then they also use the word troll to mean creatures more like gnomes in many of the stories. And the gnomes are not outright evil at all. They're just pesky. They can be very helpful, they can be very kind and friendly, and then they can just turn on a dime if you don't, behave in accordance with their laws. And they are a different race and their attitudes are different. Remember that funny, funky story, the shoemaker and the elves? And so that seems weird, right, to kids now when you tell them that story, because he feels like he wants to sew little clothing to these elves and to help them, because they've been helpful to him. And no sooner does he leave clothes out than they leave. And you go, that doesn't make any sense. But that's an example of how their logic is completely different from ours. You can't apply our logic to them. You got to know them on their own terms.
So the gnomes that they talk about in Sweden and Denmark are
sometimes called trolls.
Okay.
Yeah.
But they're more like gnomes or dwarves or elves?
Yeah, well, they're all, it all gets a little bit murky in that whole world. And so they're often referred to as, in Norwegian, they're called huldrefolket, or the people, the underground people or the hidden people. And there's many different kinds. They have many different names. There's overlaps, there's kobolds in Germany, there are brownies, and there's leprechauns, and, there's just a whole variety. And in Norwegian, we have an expression, "Kjært barn har mange navn." An appreciated an appreciated child has many names, and so I think they were appreciated. They have many names, these otherworldly creatures. This whole notion that there is an other world out there that's parallel to our world, but not readily available, not readily seen, not readily accessed. Sometimes you happen upon it. Perhaps you're one of those people who are second-sighted, so you do see it. But if you do happen in it, you have to realize that it doesn't act according to our rules, and you got to be very careful, or you might get stuck there. And so things are not what they seem. That's another one of the great lessons from folktales is, things are not always what they seem, and that's true.
And you mentioned learning your stories a lot from your parents.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about the difference between learning a story on a told version from a storyteller and learning it from a book. Like, what's different for you about that process?
I guess, part of what informs it when it's a story that I learned from, as a child is kind of that the feeling that you have when you tell it. Because when I tell a story, I don't really go ahead and memorize a story. It's more like I have an outline of the story inside my head, but then as I tell it, it's almost like narrating something I can see inside my head, or behind my eyelids or something. I tell it as I experience it, and I think that experience is much more vivid when it's stories that I learned when I was a child. I have to work more if it's a story that I'm learning from a book. It's like you read these books and then I have read thousands of stories, but there will be certain stories when you go, that's a great story. It just really resonates with me, and I know I want to tell it. But then I have to have the job. And what really helps is the actual telling, because I become the person to these kids that my father was for me and my brother. And so it's in the telling so the first few times, it's probably a very different story from when I've told it a few times and I've had that interaction with kids and, they've asked questions, and we've really talked about it. And then it becomes a part of you so that it's sort of, I don't think ever again about, the text where I first learned it. So,
Now, in addition to telling stories, you also have taken stories that you know and written them into books. Talk about that process.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, I got real Norwegian there. So initially, when I did The Troll with No Heart in His Body, I had been a storyteller, and the idea of actually writing it down was a little bit intimidating for me. It's not, I've been an English major, I taught composition, I knew how to write, but the idea of writing down these stories was scary. And so what I ended up doing for many of the books, I recorded myself. I just got a tape recorder and I got up just like I did here, and I just told those stories into the tape recorder, and then I just wrote it down. There was one book, The Adventures of Thor the Thunder God. I told all the stories to a friend's 4th grade class. I had learned them, I knew them, but it's like I had a really hard time going from knowing them and being able to tell them to actually being able to type it. I'm a crummy typist. I'm really bad at it. And so I realized that as soon as I talked, I knew how the story was supposed to go. So it was much simpler for me to just tell it and then just write that down. But then there was a second process, which is when you're writing things down, and when I tell it, there would be times when I'm really loud, or there's times when you're indicating things with gestures, or there are times when your language you're using is speeded up, and there are other times when your language is slowed down to try to make it more suspenseful. And so then I would look at that on the page and realize, okay, I have to find shorter words here, because when the reader reads it, it has to go fast. And so that reader didn't know that I had speeded up. So instead, I would have to just find words so that when they read it, it would go fast, or longer words for slower. So it was a really interesting process for me. But for almost all my books. When I wrote The Race of the Birkebeiners, about that cross-country ski race that happened, more than 800 years ago, and I just I researched, and I got lost in some kind of an academic prison inside my head. And I was so worried about kind of getting all the historical details and accuracy, blah, 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 blah. And finally my husband said, "Are you sure you don't want to write this for Smithsonian? This doesn't seem like it should be for kids." And so I was like, I threw it all away. Again, I was just right here. I got a tape recorder out, and I just got up and I started telling it, and I had the story. But, not until then. So that's an interesting process. I don't think most writers, because I'm primarily a storyteller. I appreciate the oral version of things.
What advice would you have for storytellers, whether they're brand new beginners or sort of midway through their career as a storyteller, or if they're a parent who's never told stories? What advice do you have for those folks?
You have to tell stories that you love. Don't tell stories that other people told that that you like because that telling was so good. You have to tell the stories that really resonate with you. And then never, ever, ever worry about memorizing a story. Just get down the outline of a story. It's important that you know the events that are going to happen. But if you memorize things, you just get frozen. And then to just play with it. I think, you have to just really actually be who you are. People get very intimidated when they listen to people who are, really good, like when actors perform a story and you go, "Oh my God, I'll never be able to do that." But the fact of the matter is that you are you, and there is only one you, and there is only one you on the planet who can tell a story the way you're going to tell it. It is going to be a completely unique and authentic experience. And if you just allow yourself to be there for that experience and not worry about not being as good as Meryl Streep when she tells a story or whatever, it's going to be more than good enough. I think that's one of the great things about storytelling today. It is so unique and it's so personal. And that was something I was going to say, is when you're telling a story that's really different in terms of the violence and the scary aspect of it, is that when kids look at a television screen, and they're looking at a lot of screens now, whether it's their iPads or iPhones, or you have it. What they're looking at is they're looking at somebody else's imagination. Somebody has created an image, they have created a landscape, they have clothed the princess and the prince or the young hero, or they've given the troll form, they've given the dragon form. There's nothing that the child can do to stop that. That becomes the image that's in their head. If you, as a storyteller, just say, there was this great big huge troll, he had eyes as big as pewter plates and a nose as long as a poker. That's it. But everything else is up to the child's imagination. And in general, unless they've watched too many trolls or whatever on television, they will come up with an image that's just right for their level, at their age, for where they're at. And the same is true, would say the princess is beautiful. It's all just sort of suggestions. Nobody says she was blonde and blue-eyed and had that and gown with this. That's what you see when you see a film. Or she's, a brunette with, chocolate-colored eyes and things. When you tell a story and you say that the heroine is beautiful, every girl out there is imagining that she looks like her, or she has her own vision of it. So I get really upset when people say, "Oh, they're so racist and so sexist," but that's because they've been turned into another medium where there is no more room for the imagination. Because when you're watching those films, you're asked to admire somebody else's imagination. There's nothing left for the kids to do. So I'm like, tell stories. You've got to tell stories. It's really important, because that's how you generate, just creative problem solving. If you could just hear the kind of questions kids ask and what they talk about, it can be so profound that there are times I go like, wow. Also, they say, "Oh yeah, kids don't have attention spans." That's not true. If you tell them troll stories, they'll happily sit for an hour. I know. So.
Now, along with being a storyteller, you're also a parent.
Yep.
Talk about how you use stories in your parenting.
Oh my gosh. Well, they become stories are so great because they have, um, they have images in them that somehow, resonate so much with you, you can almost not forget them. And I always feel like they travel to that place in your soul where you need them, and they stay there, and they keep coming back at different times when you need them in your life. And so they become like a reference point for kids when, things are difficult, or, there's obstacles. Stories teach you over and over again that you can't give up, that you have to persist, that you have to be creative. Try something out, so it's a subtle way, but of course I did just like my parents when they were bad, I said they were being trolls, but yeah, it was very much as just telling stories. I don't think I sort of talked about what they meant or anything. We just told stories because they're so much fun. They're so spellbinding, literally spellbinding. And I did a lot of storytelling in the school for my kids, and all of their friends. And to this day, I sometimes meet people young people, maybe in a waitress there, or somebody working in the shop, or I've been stopped in grocery store lines, and people say, I still remember that story. And then they'll tell me about a story that particularly resonated with them, and, a certain image. And, 20, close to 30 years later, that's pretty powerful. So and now I've got a little grandson, so we're at it. He loves the Three Billy Goats Gruff. I have the 3 goats that are going to go out in my yard, and every time he sees them, he goes, drip, drap, drip, drap, drip, drap, so.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Great. I can't think of any more questions. Is there anything else a lot of times, you're in a unique position of growing up in Norway and coming to the States here.
Yeah.
Americans, they often tell stories from other cultures and other nations.
Yep.
And what are the things that Americans get wrong when they tell Norwegian stories, aside from the language, which we don't always get the language. Although now with Google, you can type in words and you can hear how it's really pronounced.
Yeah.
But what are the things that Americans get wrong about Norwegian folktales?
Oh, I have minded when they try to prettify them, make the trolls be, sort of something that they're not. But I'm kind of the opinion that I don't worry. I mean, I think that, the one thing that I discovered as a storyteller when I started out was that there things that Norwegian kids would automatically know, such as how profoundly stupid, pardon my language, but profoundly stupid trolls are. They're not very bright. And, an awareness of how to trick them, that they have weaknesses. They're not just these infallible, scary, big, huge things. They, when they did the movie in the Harry Potter, the trolls were good, but they were almost a little bit too clever, too persistent. In the folktales, they're a little bit easier often to get rid of. Although, they're really aimed at older kids than saw the movies, I think. So it probably feels that way for little kids when I tell some of these stories. It feels like, oh my gosh, But I don't mind that people take traditional stories and put new clothes on them and retell them in a way that sort of suits a new time and a new place and a new culture. I mean, I think that's the beauty of folktales. They're adaptable. They will never die out. I don't worry about that, because they just put on new clothes or a new culture and a new language, and suddenly there you are. We were just talking about how Star Wars, how that is really an extended folktale or a hero's tale. Tolkien, and now there's so many contemporary writers using traditional materials with great creative effort. I mean, I'm very impressed with what a lot of them are doing. So, I'm a little bit of a purist, telling it the way, traditional way, but that doesn't mean I don't appreciate all the other ways of doing it. So.
Great.